Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, reading today from Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 2, Text 5. Pulakod bhinna sarvango munchan mila drisha shuchaha purnartho lakshitastena sneha prasara samplutaha pulakod bhinna sarvango munchan mila drisha shuchaha purnartho lakshitastena sneha prasara samplutaha pulakod bhinna sarvango munchan mila drisha shuchaha purnartho lakshitastena sneha prasara samplutaha pulakod bhinna sarvango munchan mila drisha shuchaha purnartho lakshitastena sneha prasara samplutaha pulakod bhinna sarvango munchan mila drisha shuchaha purnartho lakshitastena sneha prasara samplutaha. Pulaka udbhinna, bodily changes of transcendental ecstasy. Sarva angaha, every part of the body. Munchan, smearing. Milat, opening. Drisha, by the eyes. Shuchaha, tears of grief. Purna arthaha, complete achievement. Lakshitaha, thus observed. Tena, by vidura. Sneha prasara, extensive love. Samplutaha, thoroughly assimilated. Translation. It was so observed by Vidura that Uddhava had all the transcendental bodily changes due to total ecstasy, and he was trying to wipe away tears of separation from his eyes. Thus Vidura could understand that Uddhava had completely assimilated extensive love for the Lord. Purport. The symptoms of the highest order of devotional life were observed by Vidura, an experienced devotee of the Lord, and he confirmed Uddhava's perfectional stage of love of Godhead. Ecstatic bodily changes are manifested from the spiritual plane and are not artificial expressions developed by practice. There are 3 different stages of development in devotional service. The first stage is that of following the regulative principles prescribed in the codes of devotional service. The second stage is that of assimilation and realization of the steady condition of devotional service. And the last stage is that of ecstasy, symptomized by transcendental bodily expression. The 9 different modes of devotional service, such as hearing, chanting, and remembering, are the beginning of the process. By regular hearing of the glories and pastimes of the Lord, the impurities in the student's heart begin to be washed off. The more one is cleansed of impurities, the more one becomes fixed in devotional service. Gradually, the activities take the form of steadiness, firm faith, taste, realization, and assimilation, one after another. These different stages of gradual development of increased love of God to the highest stage. And in the highest stage, there are still more symptoms, such as affection, anger, and attachment, gradually rising in exceptional cases to the Mahabhava stage, which is generally not possible for the living entities. All these were manifested by Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the personification of love of God. In the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu by Srila Rupa Goswami, the chief disciple of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, these transcendental symptoms displayed by pure devotees like Uddhav are systematically described. We have written a summary study of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu entitled The Nectar of Devotion, and one may consult this book for more detailed information on the science of devotional service. And again, the translation. It was so observed by Vidura that Uddhav had all the transcendental bodily changes due to total ecstasy, and he was trying to wipe away tears of separation from his eyes. Thus Vidura could understand that Uddhava had completely assimilated extensive love for the Lord. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratushe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hello and welcome to Srimad Bhagavatam class. I still remember the first time I read this shlok and purport. I thought I didn't need to wait for the 10th canto. I've already got all this rasa here. And I think there's two thoughts that can come to the mind when reading texts and purports like this from Srila Prabhupada. The first is that, of course, there's a class of rascals who say that not everything is in Srila Prabhupada's books. The higher rasic things are absent. And I remember, I think it was Narasingha Maharaj who was saying that just hearing of the existence of such people is enough to qualify one to at least have a brief glimpse of the hellish planets. So that's how foolish they are. But actually they use so many words to try and say that, Srila Prabhupada does not include the higher things in his books, and all of these words they use. But really, they'll write all sorts of things, but it's a real waste of breath, because all they could say is, I've never read Srila Prabhupada's books. Because there's so many high and elevated things in there. So that's the first thought. And the second thought that I find comes with texts like this is that it's a bit out of this world. It's a bit hard to believe almost sometimes. These descriptions are very much beyond what we normally see in the world. We normally don't see people having such intense emotions and such physical responses and manifestations of such great ecstasies. Sometimes these emotions can seem very unrealistic almost. I remember back when I was I was serving under Mrugang Prabhu, running youth group, and because I was doing the Chaitanya Charitamrita classes, some of the boys decided to read some parts of CC. And obviously they hadn't read Gita yet. So they were reading some parts of CC and they were telling me, they were saying, Prabhu, I started reading, but I couldn't finish reading like a chapter. It just seemed so weird to me. And in many ways it can seem a little out of the ordinary. And that's because it is out of the ordinary. Because we're not used to seeing such things. And so some people will sometimes read these descriptions and feel like this is an exaggeration. This is a little bit out there. We hear about Mahaprabhu and the Gambhira, his teeth appearing to fall out, scraping his head against the wall. At one moment he seems very large, at another point he seems very skinny. All of these sort of things are very out there. And in general, we can take the response that, as Srila Prabhupada mentioned in the Purport, it's not so commonly seen in most living entities. And this is a point that's often reiterated by our acharyas, that the higher points of ecstasy in general we cannot experience in these bodies, which is one reason why we're not accustomed to seeing them. Because actually if we were to experience even the bhava after bhava, the bhava after prem, even if we were to experience that, our bodies would likely burn up. They would break down. They would not actually be capable of experiencing those higher emotions, which is another reason why the perfected devotees who reach those higher stages, they don't go straight to Goloka Vrindavan. They enter into the earth, the manifested pastimes of Krishna, in whichever universe they're being manifested in. Because then they will be born into the spiritual body in which they can cultivate those higher moods. Because in this body it becomes a little hard. So even though prema is perfection, there is still growth in perfection. And even at the higher levels, there's always growth in perfection. Prabhupada writes in one of his purports in second canto that even Krishna himself cannot measure the ecstasy in Goloka Vrindavan. Because at any point when he tries to measure the ecstasy, it's already grown infinitely more. So whatever measurement Krishna gives is always outdated by half a second or so. So there's always room for perfection within perfection itself. And this is so one way we can understand why we don't generally see this. Because if we were to see it, we actually wouldn't see it. We'd see somebody's body sort of combust away in the higher things. But still, nevertheless, we do see some things like this, just because we don't see necessarily Mahabhav in most people. We still sometimes will see other higher emotions. And those are also very hard to perceive. There's a very famous pastime of His Holiness Srila Gaur Govinda Maharaj in Mayapur Dham. He was there for the annual meeting. It's a rather famous pastime. And during it, or rather in the build-up to it, Maharaj, he passed out. And he seemed to go a little mad, so to speak. And no one really knew what to do. So Trivikrama Maharaj took him to Lagudi Prabhu, who's other senior Prabhupada disciple. And they took Gaur Govinda Maharaj to him, because Lagudi Prabhu was good with medicinal things. But they were all very confused, and for days Maharaj was like this. They didn't know what was wrong. Some devotees said, maybe Gaur Govinda Maharaj has been possessed by a ghost. Other people said, maybe he's been poisoned. So they had all these ideas and they weren't sure, and they took Maharaj to all the Ayurvedic doctors. And all the Ayurvedic doctors also were just confused. They didn't know what was going on. And so Maharaj was like this for a long while. And people really had no idea what was happening. But at one point, Akinchana Krishna Das Babaji Maharaj, who we read about in Leelamrita a lot, Srila Prabhupada very much approved of his insights and realizations. He was asked to come because he was visiting the Mayapur campus, and they thought maybe Maharaj will know. Because Babaji Maharaj is such a revered godbrother of Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada very much told us that we're allowed to take input from him. So they invited him, and Maharaj came, and he had a piece of paper, and he put it in front of Gaur Govinda's nostrils, and Gaur Govinda Maharaj's nostrils. And putting it in front of Maharaj's nostrils, he was just trying to see if Maharaj was actually passing away. And he could see the piece of paper was moving, so he said, and then he started laughing. And everyone was sort of thinking, well, it isn't a laughing matter, Maharaj. Why are you laughing? And he merely smiled and he said, this is bhava. This is a symptom of bhava. Don't worry, he'll come out of it soon. And eventually Maharaj did come out of it. But I think that's a very interesting pastime that sort of displays how hard it is to understand not even prema at that point, bhava. And this is an expression of bhava. So this is how beyond our experience such things are. But if we did not have the guidance of Shastras, and if we did not have the guidance of very senior and advanced devotees, we wouldn't be able to understand these sort of things at all. Of course, the manifestation of all these sort of amazing things, if it's ecstasies or in many ways a greater manifestation, like the great preaching work that's done by our acharyas, all of these things that are beyond human comprehension. These are all signs that maybe there's something more going on to life than working 9 to 5 and doing whatever else people do, watching TV, eating meat, whatever. There's maybe something more beyond just whatever material world is before me. But even then, we see these things, we might be able to hint from them that there's something beyond my experience. But we wouldn't be able to in any way understand what's going on. So we require the Shastras in order to understand things like prema and bhava, these higher things. Even in many ways to understand anything beyond we're not this body. Srila Prabhupada said, outside of the Vedic context, realizing you're not your body is pretty much as far as you can go on your own. After that, you really need some help. And unfortunately in these days, you need help to get even to the level if you're not this body. Even to the level if you might not be satisfied just watching TV and having illicit sex. Even that now requires some extra help. Can't exactly get there on their own. So we need the Vedic literatures to understand these things. But as we see in the pastime of Gaur Govinda Maharaj, even the Vedic literatures, obviously a lot of the people who had seen Gaur Govinda Maharaj, a lot of them had read a lot of the Vedic literatures, they had studied them, but they struggled to recognize that this is the bhava we're reading about. And there's a story that reminds me of what this sort of alludes to. Because we can read books, but we can't necessarily understand them. We can study books, but we don't necessarily understand them. And even if we then try to have somebody explain them to us, there's so many different ways to understand it. And there was a story I was reading. I've been reading a tiny bit about Islamic history. And there's a really nice story, I think, that illustrates this. After Hazrat Muhammad, after he passed away, there was a line of people known as the caliphs. And the caliphs were like the kings of the caliphate. Caliph just means the representative. So they were considered like representatives of Muhammad. So these caliphs would go on. And the first two, everyone loved. They were highly successful kings. Definitely would have won a re-election if they were in a democracy. Abu Bakr and Umar. And if you go to in any Muslim context, except for Shia Muslim context, they don't really like them. But if you go to the majority of Muslim contexts, they'll speak really highly of Abu Bakr and Umar. However, after Abu Bakr and Umar came Uthman, or Uthman. And Uthman, he was not so popular. Interestingly enough, though, he's the one who actually writes down the Quran. Before him, the Quran was an oral traditions and differing oral traditions, but there was no standard text of the Quran. And Uthman decided, under me, we'll write down the Quran, which was a good enough work. It's just unfortunate that he's known as sort of the weakest of the first four. Anyways, he was killed by a mob because they really didn't like him. Like, he was very unpopular. So a mob stormed into his house and they killed him. And then after him was Ali. So because of all the political unrest under Uthman's reign, Ali inherited a caliphate that was filled with rebellions. Everyone was just rebelling because they just didn't like Uthman. And after Ali, the sort of idyllic age of the wonderful caliphs ends. That's when even Muslims will say that the caliphs just became not the best people. So Ali sort of inherits this context, and he's leading his armies against, it's actually more complex than this, but I don't want to turn this into an Islamic history class instead of a Bhagavatam class. But he's fighting against one of the main opponents to the caliphate. And at one point he decides, I just want peace in the caliphate so I can focus on other things, like finding out who killed Uthman. They still didn't find it out because he didn't have any time to do anything besides stop all the rebellions. So he negotiated peace with one of the rebels. But there was a small section of extremists in his army who were very, very unhappy that Hazrat Ali decided to negotiate peace. They were very, very upset with him. They broke off from his army and started their own rebellion. The poor guy just kept on having rebellions. Every move he did, another rebellion would spring up, unhappy by his previous actions. So these guys, they still exist today in a more moderate form. Funnily enough, when they started off, if you take every single negative stereotype of Muslims, and those of us from Indian backgrounds have probably heard a few, if you take every single very negative stereotype, these sort of exaggerated, bigoted sort of views, they were all very true of this group. Think of the most negative image you can possibly have of Muslims, and that's what these, they were called the Khawarij. They still exist today, funnily enough, as the most moderate denomination of Islam. So they went from one sect to the other end. So these guys, they were very upset with Ali, and they were, because they weren't politically driven like the others, they didn't want power. They wanted vengeance, they wanted justice, and those sort of rebellions are much harder to quell. As long as one of them survived, he would go and preach to someone else and the army would start up again. So Ali decided it was too hard to just defeat them in battle. So he went to them personally and he discussed with them. He said, why do you hate me so much? What's the big hatred? You used to fight for me, you used to be in my armies, and now you hate me. And they said, according to the Quran, there is no reason why you could have negotiated peace with that other person. According to the Quran, he must be killed. We cannot negotiate peace with him. So you have made yourself the higher authority over the Quran. They told him this. They said, the Quran is the only arbiter of truth in Muslim society. You are not the arbiter of truth. And so Ali, he asked one of his servants to bring a copy of the Quran. And so it was brought before them, and it was put in the middle of the two groups. And Ali said, he began to ask it questions. He said, what should I have done then? And then he would just ask it, please speak, please speak. And then he invited the Khawarij to do the same. Please ask it some questions. And obviously it didn't say anything. And Ali, he said, yes, the scripture is the ultimate arbiter of truth. But the scripture ultimately, while, of course, very high, ultimately the form we have scripture in is pages held between cloth. And that cannot speak. God has not given books the ability to speak, but he has given humans the ability to speak. So although scripture is the highest arbiter, it is the nature of reality that God has made it that humans are the ones who speak its truth. And the moment then you have to understand it, to speak it, the moment humans are the arbiters of what scripture says, then suddenly we enter into the world of differing interpretations. So you do not have your high horse that we stick to scripture. Because by you reading it, the moment you've read the text, you yourself have also interpreted it. You've interpreted it by giving meanings to words, by bringing your own life experiences to the text. No matter what you do, you bring your own biases. You bring your own interpretation. You do not have a pure reading of the text. So you pretty much tell them, get off your high horse. You are just as much interpreting the Quran as I am. And this is true of all texts. Any text we approach, we will always have a bias. People will always bring their own assumptions to the text. People will always bring their own assumptions to anything. I remember when I was last in Mayapur, I was speaking to one of my friends, and we were discussing the GBC. Nothing negative or anything, we were just discussing the role of the GBC in ISKCON and all. And I realized, because he had come from a heavily Catholic background, he was in fact going to become a Catholic priest before he became a devotee. And I realized the way he was describing the GBC was exactly how Catholics describe the Council of Bishops. He was speaking with almost the exact same terminology. And so, in nuanced ways, the way he felt about the GBC was different to the way that I felt. We both felt positively, but we both felt in a slightly different thought process. Because obviously we both come from different perspectives. We have our different biases. And so it's impossible to read a text in a non-biased way. The moment you've read a text, it is biased. So then as devotees, how are we able to access the Bhagavatam and other shastras, other texts? Because when we come to it, we bring our own biases. And for the majority of us, those biases are material ones. But the principle that we have is not even that the bias, so to speak, that we accept is that of a spiritual one. Because there are even spiritual biases, so to speak, that we do not accept. We worship and accept Srila Ramanujacharya, Srila Madhvacharya. We worship and respect them. In Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's Samadhi, you can see there's the great murtis of Radha and Krishna, and all around on the sides you'll find murtis of all the 4 acharyas of each of the Vaishnava Sampradayas. So we definitely do acknowledge and honor them. But at the end of the day, we don't take Madhvacharya's commentary that the gopis are not the highest devotees. We do not accept that. Because ultimately the bias that we accept as devotees is the bias of prem. To go back to the beginning of the point, the bias through which, or the apparent bias through which we accept the Shastra is prem. It is through the lens of prema that we accept the readings of Bhagavatam. And that's why Srila Prabhupada's purports are so important. Because otherwise there's so many different biases we can bring to the text. I remember I was quickly skimming through some, I was trying to find a shloka in second canto. I can't remember exactly which shloka I was looking for. But I was skimming through and I was just seeing the texts alone, just because I wanted to find the text. And I thought, reading this chapter, I could really become a Mayavadi. Without the purports, without any of the other previous teaching. If I had just read this chapter alone, I could really see how I could think, all of the nonsense that Mayavadis do think. So without the purports, we don't have the proper bias. Sometimes people will say, do I really need to read the purports? What if I go and I just read the Sanskrit? That should be enough. In fact, I sometimes hear this by some devotees. They'll say, I just want to learn Sanskrit so I can understand what the Bhagavad Gita really means. And what I always say is, even if you learned Sanskrit to the point of being a great pundit, the best pundit in the world, you will understand it infinitely less if you read the Sanskrit than if you just read the English purports. Because then, just because you're reading Sanskrit doesn't mean you've cut away behind the biases. You still brought the biases of how you learned Sanskrit, of your background, of all these different things. Which meanings you have for words are influenced by your context. Once you've put the words together, what those words actually mean, you interpret within whatever worldview you bring to the text. But this is, again, the glory of the Bhaktivedanta purports. Through prema, through Krishna prema, this is the bias which we accept as the authoritative bias. This is the bias we as devotees accept most fully. And this is also why sometimes we will find that the acharyas seem to differ. We'll find small differences, nothing substantial. It's not that any acharya has said that, Ramchandra is the original personality of Godhead. All of the main points are the same. But we'll find some small differences that are there among our acharyas. Some small ones are like, if you see any old black and white photos of the Gauriya Math, with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur and all, if you look at their bead bags, if you look even in black and white, you'll be able to tell their bead bags are a different shade than their robes. Because Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he instituted that his sannyasis should all use white bead bags. Even not saffron. The robes are saffron, but the bead bags are white. Srila Prabhupada, as we can see, used a saffron bead bag. That's not a faith-destroying contradiction, nor should it be. That's another one is that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in general didn't like putting beards on Advaitacharya's murti, because Advaitacharya does not age, he is eternal. Srila Prabhupada, as we know, in Mayapur, we can see the beautiful murti of Advaita Acharya, he didn't mind having a beard put on Advaita Acharya. Another example would be Srila Prabhupada was fine with Mahaprabhu wearing a peacock feather. But Gaur Govinda Maharaj didn't really let his disciples do that. So these sort of apparent minor contradictions aren't really contradictions. Another very famous example is from that Gita shloka. Aparyaptam, how does it go? Aparyaptam tadasmakam. I can't, yeah. Yeah, that one. There's a very famous example with this because some of our acharyas, like Baladev Vidyabhushan, they will say, well, this text says that Bhishma is stronger than Bhima's army. But Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that, well, this text says Bhima is stronger than Bhishma. Because the Sanskrit is, you can take it either way. So there is another apparent contradiction. But these apparent contradictions, and they very much are just that, apparent, they arise from the fact that prema is ecstasy, it is love. And love is very much, true love is very much defined by an individual. It is not that the acharyas are not individual people. It is not that each one of our acharyas is just the same person coming again and again and again. They are individuals. They are unique. And their prema, the specific flavor of their rasa, is each one unique. And so, as that rasa comes out, we'll find slightly different tastes, slightly different attitudes among things. And this is not at all a cop-out. We find even in Krishna Lila, all of the denizens of Raj, they are all perfected, they're all great, but they'll disagree among each other. They'll have slightly different approaches on how to please Krishna. And none of them are less pleasing, even among the same mood. Some will do something one way, and another will do things another way. But how do we know they're all the same? How do we know they're all the same in principle? It's because the essence is always there of prema, of bhakti, Krishna bhakti, love for Krishna. This is what unites them all. The tattva is the same. So small expressions like this might be different, because of course, how can we deny to the acharyas to be personalities? If we deny that they're persons, then we become mayavadis. We become impersonalists. We want our gurus, our acharyas, our sadhus to have no personality, to be merged away. So these small expressions of personality, rather than being something that's awkward to get around, they can, obviously those examples aren't exactly faith-shattering, which is why I like those examples. They're not exactly faith-shattering, but really any sort of secondary issue where we might find some difference, and there will be differences. Srila Prabhupada mentions that also in Nectar of Devotion. Those things are just a result of our philosophy, rather than something we have to get around. We would expect that if our acharyas are all individual persons. So it is through this bias that we understand the Shastra. This is the way that we understand all of our texts, but not just our texts. Not just the Shastras we are to understand through the application given by those with the bias of prema. Not just the books, but also the world itself. Srila Prabhupada, so wonderfully, he would see anything and he would dovetail it in Krishna's service. We know the very famous example of the first Ratha Yatra. Everyone else saw an old car, and Srila Prabhupada saw a Rath for Jagannath. So not just the Shastras, but the whole world is interpreted, again, through the eyes of prema. Prema chakshush, if we will. There's Shastra chakshush, but for those great devotees, there's also prema chakshush. They see through the eyes of prema. And if we don't follow in the example that they set of attaching everything to Krishna, then we very much move away from the principle they've given us on how to interpret the world. If we see prasadam as food, then we will not get the full benefit of prasadam. We will get some benefit for sure, but not the full benefit. There was Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, had one disciple, and his disciple was a very famous one. I think Prabhupada even quotes him in one letter, N.K. Sanyal. He was like an intimate editor during the time of the Harmonist magazine and all. And he was an academic, and so was his brother. But his brother was a non-devotee. And that brother came once to the mutt because his brother kept on saying, come, come, it's really, really nice here. And so he came, and he saw, and they all honored prasad. And at the end, he told his brother, he said, that food was really nice. And his brother said, what food? What food are you talking about? He said, you know that food that we ate? And he said, oh, no, we didn't eat. There wasn't any food, and we weren't eating either. There was prasadam, and we were honoring it. We were savoring it, of course. That's not to say we should hold our nose and try not to enjoy prasad. In fact, there's a quote I think in one Purana, I've forgotten which one, which actually says that Krishna eats prasad with his eyes, but he tastes it on the tongue of his devotee. So we should enjoy prasad, but still with that right attitude. Again, that there is nothing material in spiritual practice. There is nothing that is separate from Krishna. And how do we see how to do this, though? Again, for most people, we do not have the prema chakshush. We do not inherently and spontaneously come to to understand these things naturally. So we must see them acted out. We must see it. And this is the importance of the acharyas. This is where so many nitya siddha devotees come down as well. Of course, sadhana siddha devotees as well manifest and show us the proper way. But the nitya siddhas have they show throughout their entire life. This is what it means to be a devotee. Again, we can read of the glories of a devotee, but then we see a personality like Srila Prabhupada, Srila Gauragovinda Maharaj, so many disciples of Srila Prabhupada as well, who in their activities show us exactly what it means to connect not just all Shastra to the high conception of Radha and Krishna, but also how to connect all of reality to that, and how to do so properly. Because everything is to be interpreted within the light of prem or bhakti. Sorry, I just dry throat. So then everything is to be read within and experienced within such a perspective. And again, this is the great fault of the academics, of the scholars, of anyone who tries to approach Shastra or even reality outside of such a perspective. Hridayananda Goswami, he gives a nice example that the way the academics read the Bhagavatam is like seeing a beautiful butterfly and wanting to understand it by killing it and chopping it up. You won't really be able to either appreciate the butterfly, and you'll very, very much insult it by using the systems that they do. Analyzing words here or there, finding connections. And they find cool connections, and I'm sure the person studying the butterfly finds cool things about butterflies by ripping it apart. But they don't do much service to the butterfly. And so the academics don't do much service to the Bhagavatam either. Because they do not approach it in the proper way. I remember really realizing this when I was seeing, there was a video of my spiritual master, His Holiness Radha Govinda Das Goswami Maharaj. There was a video that some of my godbrothers were sending around of Guru Maharaj with his brother, Srila Radharaman Maharaj. And they were both reading Bhagavatam together. And as they were turning each page, they would start laughing. And they would find humor in it. They would laugh. And they would smile, genuinely happy. And there's another pastime of my spiritual master, I remember, that also emphasized this point when him and Gauragovinda Maharaj, when Guru Maharaj and Gauragovinda Maharaj met for the second time. They went away from their disciples, and all the disciples could overhear was some vague Krishna Katha. They couldn't hear exactly what it was, but what they could hear clearly was that both of them were weeping intensely upon hearing Hari Katha from each other. From here, I was thinking about that, and I thought this is the proper way to read Bhagavatam. Not that we see words on the page, but that we see Krishna dancing on the page. that we see all the pastimes happening. That we see not words and grammatical rules, but we see the wonderful rasa of Krishna and his devotees interacting. This is the heart of the Bhagavatam, because the Bhagavatam is not just a book, it is Krishna himself. How often do we approach the Bhagavatam and we, in the ocean of word for words and purports, which of course are great and glorious, and we should spend our time studying, especially the purports. There's one letter Prabhupada wrote to Hayagriva, I think, who was at that time helping Prabhupada write the Bhagavad Gita as it is, and he was taking too long. Prabhupada told him, he said, if you're struggling to do the translations, to transcribe them, just copy them from another book. My purports are the important part. If it means you're taking too long to get the purports down, just copy the translations from somewhere else. We'll get to them another time. But it is the purports that are important. This is what Prabhupada said. So those are all very important things. But sometimes we're so used to reading regular books, mundane books. It's easy to forget that what we are seeing before us is Krishna himself in the form of a book. We approach Radha Gopinath, and we approach with the mood of darshan. But that same mood should be the mood that we approach Bhagavatam with, that we are having darshan of the Supreme Lord in front of us. When we study, it is the same way that when we see what dress is Srimati Radharani of Radha Gopinath wearing today, what is the color of Krishna, of Gopinath's dhoti today. In the same way that we see these details, we are not scrutinizing them, we're not trying to figure them out. Sometimes we'll hear people say, I want to master the Bhagavatam. We don't go in front of Radha Gopinath and say, I want to master Radha Gopinath. If we say such a thing, it almost feels sick to think of somebody even saying that. What do we think? We think, I want to be mastered by Radha Gopinath. And so this is the same mood that we must approach Bhagavatam with. I wish to be mastered by Bhagavatam. It is an act of darshan, in fact, to study Bhagavatam, to hear Bhagavatam, all of these things. And there's the pastime that I very much love of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in Jagannath Puri, where he tells all his disciples, darshan means you are seen, not that you see. So this is the other aspect of Bhagavatam. Often we try to bring our minds into the Bhagavatam. We try to insert ourselves into the Bhagavatam. We see the words of Bhagavatam and we try to figure it out. But darshan in many ways is also both ways. How often do we, so to speak, let the Bhagavatam view us? How often do we present ourselves to the Bhagavatam and let it analyze us, let it break us down? How often do we present ourselves to the Bhagavatam and let its teachings, let Krishna himself impact us? And that's the real value in the Bhagavatam. Again, how much the Bhagavatam, again, sees us if we approach it in the right way. But academics don't understand this. They don't even understand to go through parampara, let alone darshan, and all these high things. So this is their flaw. And this is then the value, again, of the Bhaktivedanta purports, because we can then understand these things better. We can understand darshan, the correct ways of approaching Shastra, the correct ways of approaching the world. But we might say, well, that's all very well and good that we approach Bhagavatam through the bias of prema. That's all very well and good. We've approached through the lens of prema. But most of us aren't experiencing prema. Most of us aren't on that platform. And so we might say the same thing. We might say, oh, well, we might say, well, in the same way that we bring our biases to the Bhagavatam, we bring our own biases to the purports. We bring our own interpretation to the purports, and we see this. His Grace Krishna Kirti Prabhu sometimes says, Veda base is both the greatest thing to happen to ISKCON and the worst. Because anytime there's a disagreement, there's a person who's Control F, searched through the keywords, ignored all the texts that don't back them up, and taken all of the texts that back them out with context or without context, and then copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste. And we see this on both sides of virtually every single controversy, or not even controversy, discussion. Some people will have differing views, and they're just one search through Vedabase away from being the final Siddhanta conclusion bearer of the argument. So we might say, so many people, they'll come with this view and that view. So we can just do the same thing. You've said, oh, now we understand the Bhagavatam fully. Now we understand all the other Shastra fully. The realizations that we see even of the Gayatri mantras, of Dhammadarashtakam, of all of these texts, many of them, the commentaries, no one could have figured out on their own. By all logic, by all even devotion, spiritual logic, by all spiritual logic, you would not be able to find Radha and Krishna in the Brahma Gayatri at the least. And yet our acharyas have done so. Because that bias of prem has allowed them to pull out Radha and Krishna out of every Shastra. But you might say, well, so you've said now we approach through the purports, but we don't have prem, so maybe then we interpret the purports our own way. And we find this in many ways, especially on the hard right or the hard left of ISKCON, I find. We'll find people have their own previous feelings about the way the world should be. And they'll read it into Prabhupada's books. Of course, Prabhupada told us really that all politicians are demons, but that's not such a popular thing. Prabhupada told us politicians are all demons, but every time an election happens, in any part of the world, we'll find devotees who are saying, this, you find some devotees, especially with the recent American election, the way they speak about either Biden or Trump, you'd think they're describing Shaktivesh avatars. The glories that they give, and they're saying, if Prabhupada was having his manifest leelas here today, he would clearly support one of our candidates. But we know how Prabhupada treated politicians, and it wasn't very supportive. It was very critical of their demonic nature. And if we need any emphasis on how demonic all politicians are, I think we can look at I'm not saying anything bad about the lockdowns, but I mean the way that governments have prioritized certain services over others. Brothels got so much care under our government, not our government, every government. I'm not making a political statement, just a statement of the world itself. Brothels got more care under most governments than temples or churches or mosques, because those aren't really necessary. Oh, but brothels are. Liquor stores were kept open in most places, and there were careful rules, and I'm not against the rules or anything, don't get me wrong, but we can see the priorities of these governments, that brothels and liquor stores, they're essential services, but churches and temples, put them to the side. So, we find then, people will approach Prabhupada's purports and they can find all sorts of justifications. They'll look at all sorts of things, again, conservative or progressive. They'll find all these sorts of ideas in Prabhupada's books, and each side will have their own thing. Because a lot of them, again, they're reading in their interpretation. So it's not an incorrect criticism of that point to make, to say, well, people do bring their own interpretations even to Prabhupada's purports. So then what do we do? Well, the answer to that is that even though we do not have the bias of prem, the bias of prem is not exactly for us. The bias of prem is for the great sadhus who are experiencing it. And we try to follow in that bias of prem. It is not that we try to emulate, like the sahajiyas, the bias of prem. Instead, we have the seed of prem. Because we know prema is the 9th stage of devotion. And what is the first? It is shraddha. It is faith. Faith is the seed which eventually culminates in prema. So we do not have prema, but hopefully we have some shraddha, some faith. So that is the bias through which we read all of the texts composed by those with the bias of prem. It is through the bias of shraddha, through the bias of faith, which is why sometimes people will say, I remember my university professor told me this once. We were looking at Ishopanishad, and he was talking about the invocation. He's saying all this Mayavad stuff, and I just told him, you're wrong. This is. Then I gave the description that Srila Prabhupada gives of the relation of the world to the Supreme Lord, and he said, oh yeah, but this is your devotee bias. This is your Hare Krishna bias you're bringing into it. This is the bias of faith. And I was very happy that he could describe me in that way. I took that as a very big compliment, because the bias of shraddha is a bias, but it is a very good bias to have, because everyone has a bias. He is biased in his atheistic ways when he approaches the text. He can't claim he's reading some unbiased version. When they say, I want an unbiased version, they mean I want the version that agrees with me. We all have biases. So I will happily take, and that was a compliment greater than I do have. I don't have as much Shraddha as I think he liked to attribute to me. But that is a very good compliment to receive, and that is a very good bias to have. I would much rather have the bias of Shraddha in the perfected souls who are happy and joyous and ecstatic in any situation, clearly on a platform beyond this world. I'd rather have a bias of faith in them than the bias of faith in my faulty, conditioned body, in all of the great acharyas of the scientific world who are all depressed and not really having the best time. I think Shraddha and faith in those great devotees is much higher. So this is the bias by which we can understand and we can properly approach. And this is, I don't want to seem too heavy, but this is the issue with then all of the devotees who seem to be really interpreting Prabhupada's purports in one way or another. And I think there is at times a lack of Shraddha in Srila Prabhupada and a great Shraddha in all of the things that they had in their life before. All of the previous things. His Holiness Gaur Govinda Maharaj, and I'll finish on this point. He gave a really wonderful class. What is Vaishnavism? A very pertinent topic. And he said, he was speaking all these wonderful glories of the devotees. And then he said at one point, he started speaking about Shraddha. And he said, Dhruva Maharaj, all of you are saying, I do not have enough faith. I do not have enough faith. Dhruva Maharaj just hears once, oh, Narayan is there. And with all faith and commitment, we know Narad Muni was so impressed, he almost laughed and said, this is the certitude of the Kshatriya, when he saw the complete resolve that Dhruva Maharaj had. Just by hearing it, Dhruva Maharaj went and performed such intense tapasyas that the whole world was quite literally suffocated. Prahlad Maharaj, so much suffering he apparently went through. Of course, pain is not optional, but suffering is. There's no suffering for the pure devotee. But so much he went through, and yet he constantly had the faith in the Supreme Lord. Devotees today, something natural like a death will happen, and many of them will lose their faith. Even though death is something that has to happen, and yet even then a death will happen and they will lose all their faith. Why did this have to happen? As if it's the first time it's ever happened in history. We look at Prahlad Maharaj. What he went through doesn't have to happen. And yet, his faith was still completely there. The Shraddha was there. And Gaur Govinda Maharaj said, the reason why is because the Vaishnav is simple. Simplicity is Vaishnavism. And children are simple. Children have simplicity. You all were simple once, but then you had the association of the adult world. And there you encountered crookedness and deceit and cheating and all of these other things. And then you picked them up and you learned them. This is what growing up, so to speak, means in the material world. Learn how to become part of the cheating system. So he said this. He said, the reason, and that's the reason why. These are the two examples we always give for strong faith. Dhruva Maharaj and Prahlad Maharaj. And they're both children. Not a coincidence. Because children embody the simplicity that is necessary for Vaishnavism. And simplicity is the bedrock of Shraddha. Shraddha is very, very simple. I remember my grandmother. She just recently had coronavirus. She's now recovered from it. But I remember after she had it, I rang her and I was speaking to her. I was expecting all sorts of things. Because of course at her age it's very traumatic to have coronavirus. And all she told me was, Shob Gopaler Leela. This is all the Leela of Gopal. What to do. She didn't need to give me a logical response. Why is there suffering in the world? Why is there pain? Why did I have to get coronavirus even though I followed the lockdown strictly? All of these things that would be very valid frustrations. Because I found in that moment she had that simplicity. And because of that simplicity, she had that strong Shraddha to be able to just say, everything is Gopal's Leela. So, simplicity is the bedrock of that Shraddha. Simplicity is therefore that great Vaishnava principle, to not be duplicitous, to be simple, to follow chastely the spiritual master's instructions, and not anything else, even kirtans. Kirtans, lectures, all of these things, even books, in one sense they're all sound. And sound is the most subtle of all elements. And because it's the most subtle of all elements, corruption is the hardest to pick up. It's very nuanced, it's very subtle. Imagine the subtlety of corrupting something that's already very subtle. But because of its subtlety, it also penetrates the deepest. So it's corruption that's hardest to notice, but also the most damaging when it reaches us. This is why we must be most guarded, and Prabhupada stressed this, with our listening and our hearing. Because all sorts of corruptions can come in. That's why many times people will like to listen to kirtans of Mayavadis, like this Krishna Das and all of these people. But actually it's not kirtan. They've never done kirtan in their life. It's just aparad. It's not sankirtan, it's samaparad. Really. It's unfortunately what it is. But it's hard to pick that up. So, which is why it's best to just listen to kirtans of devotees that we know are situated in a good position. Somebody might say, oh, well, it's the holy name. How can that be corrupted? Well, sound is very subtle. It's very hard to pick up on it. Better to play it safe. So to listen mainly to one spiritual master, and who the spiritual master recommends, Srila Prabhupada, mainly engage with Srila Prabhupada's books. We must guard ourselves most with sound. And this is one essential part of simplicity. So simplicity is the bedrock of Shraddha. And therefore, Gaur Govinda Maharaj, he says, and with this crookedness, we are not able to get the spiritual master's mercy, because we want something out of the spiritual master. We're so used to the crookedness, where we approach people to get something out of them, that then we go towards the spiritual master not simple, not ready to just serve him and his transcendental sound vibration, but we wish to get something out of him. And then with our crookedness, we do not receive the mercy of Vaishnava. And then he says, Sadhu Guru Mahajan, the great devotees, the great gurus, the great sadhus, they are patita pavana. They are the savior of the most fallen, but they are not the savior of the most crooked. We might be fallen, but we should still have a simplicity, and then we will transcend our fallen nature. Anyways, Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai.